I'm Jesse Ventura. Stay vigilant, question more. Welcome to my world. Come along for the ride. The world according to Jesse. Today we look at wildfires in California, the indictment of Steve Bannon, and the state of globalization. Sit tight. The show starts now. The world according to Jesse.
Hi, I'm Brigida Santos. For our top story today, we look at the local news here in California, where at least 7 people have died over the past 2 weeks as more than 600 active wildfires tear through the state. California is in the midst of a record-breaking heat wave, with temperatures in the Death Valley reaching 130 degrees Fahrenheit. That's just 4 degrees shy of the hottest temperature ever recorded on Earth back in 1913. Now, since mid-August, CAL FIRE has recorded at least 13,000 lightning strikes. Lightning ignited 10 of the most recent fires. The largest group of blazes to note this week are in Northern California. A 350,000-acre fire, known as the LNU Lightning Complex, has burned through parts of Napa, Sonoma, Solano, and Lake counties. On Wednesday, it stood at 33% containment. Simultaneously, another fire east of San Jose, known as the SCU Lightning Complex, stands at 25% containment at the time of taping. Now, 7,000 wildfires have already burned over 1.4 million acres of land in California this year. In comparison, by this time last year, 56,000 acres had been consumed in wildfires. This comes alongside the COVID-19 pandemic, of course. Now, emergency workers in the state are spread incredibly thin. There are now more than 14,000 firefighters from 10 states battling the flames. Governor Gavin Newsom has also asked Canada and Australia to send firefighters to assist. This could not come at a worse time, Jesse.
No, it couldn't. I mean, we're in the middle of the pandemic, the COVID-19. That in itself is a mess across the country. And now we've got California burning up again. Now, it seems to me, Brigida, I don't have the greatest memory in the world all the time, but this seems like 3, 4, 5 years in a row. It seems it's getting as popular as snow falling in Minnesota in January that we're going to have fires in the state of California. It seems like it's an every year issue now. And I can only state that I believe part of this is caused by our polluting and climate change. Because look at the temperatures we're getting now. These are temperatures that are almost higher than the temperatures ever been recorded on the planet, and we're getting them consistently. It's not a one-time only deal now. It's consistent, and we better watch out. And because if we don't do something about our polluting, this is what's going to kill mankind.
Yeah, we're having a once-in-a-century heat wave, we're having a once-in-a-century pandemic, and these fires are a double whammy for local schools, which are struggling to safely reopen during the pandemic. Now, some of the schools that have already reopened are now being forced to close again, this time due to poor air quality. Blazes during the health crisis have also created new challenges for the American Red Cross, which is partnering with local hotels to house evacuees due to the quarantine and social distancing regulations, while they're also running wildfire evacuation centers. Some senior citizens say that they've chosen not to go to shelters over fears about their health. Instead, they're actually sheltering with friends or family. Jesse?
Well, I'll tell you, Brigida, right now more than ever, we need top-down leadership in the United States of America. That means President Trump. He's failing miserably on the pandemic. It's the worst in our country than any other country on the planet. Now California's dealing with these wildfires at the same time, which again, you look at Trump's position, he's anti-climate change. So this stuff is going to continue on his watch from now and probably forever, who knows. But if we don't get some leadership and we don't have people take climate change real, which Trump seems to have a major problem looking and deciding things that have science involved in them.
In other news, former chief White House strategist Steve Bannon and 3 others have been indicted for allegedly defrauding 500,000 donors out of $25 million in contributions to a crowdfunding campaign known as We Build the Wall. Federal prosecutors say donors were repeatedly assured that all contributions would go towards constructing a fence along the U.S.-Mexico border. While some of the money was used as intended, Bannon reportedly funneled at least $1 million in contributions to himself through a nonprofit that he controlled. The campaign organizer, Brian Kolfage, also reportedly used some of the money to pay for a luxury car, a golf cart, jewelry, home renovations, plastic surgery, tax payments, and credit card debt. Early on, Jesse, critics said privatizing border wall construction would pave the way to corruption and weaken oversight and accountability. And of course, here we are.
Well, I'll tell you, Brigitte, maybe it was done by design. After all, Donald Trump seems to be focused on only things that help him and his buddies. So the creation of this whole wall down on the Mexican border and private industry participating in it, like they said, it's just waiting for corruption to happen, and lo and behold, we've got it now. Corruption on the wall. I think this could have been designed from the start to be this, a big money-making scheme for Bannon, Trump, and all his associates. We'll build a wall down on the border, we'll get private industry, we'll get good deals, no bid contracts, all the garbage that can go along with it, and we'll all walk away with big fat wallets at the end of the day, building what to me is a useless wall to begin with.
Bannon, the former executive chair of Breitbart News, is the 7th close associate of President Donald Trump to face federal charges since Trump took office. Bannon and his campaign co-conspirators here have all been charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. They now face up to 20 years in prison for allegedly routing money through a nonprofit and shell company they control and then hiding the money with fake invoices and fraudulent vendor deals. But Jesse, make your prediction. Are any of these guys actually going to serve time?
Well, you know, President Trump's already said, he made a statement about Bannon saying, oh, this is nothing but a political, as he likes to term it, witch hunt. Absolutely, I don't think none of them will face any time. Flynn's not facing any time. Stone isn't facing any time. If they get convicted, it's simple. Donald Trump will pardon them, like he does all the crooks that hang around with him. These people are safe and sound as long as Donald Trump gets reelected. Now, if he doesn't get reelected, then you might have a whole new ball game facing these people. So you can bet they're going to be working extra hard to make sure Donald Trump gets reelected, and that way they don't have to face any jail time. They'll be able to run away with all the money they've embezzled probably, and in the end, who will be the losers? The people of the United States of America and the people of Mexico.
In economic news, analysts at Bank of America reveal that 80% of global sectors are facing supply chain disruptions due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This has pushed American and European-based companies to consider shifting their Chinese supply chains to the domestic front or shore up in the territories of their international allies. Moving export operations out of China that are not intended for Chinese consumption will reportedly cost American and European firms $1 trillion over 5 years. Now, on one hand, we could see a shift from globalization towards a more local approach, which could be a good thing for certain working people in the U.S. who typically lose when companies outsource labor and manufacturing jobs abroad. And as we've seen with the pandemic, when essential items are not made at home, it's hard to get them, especially at an affordable price. But on the other hand, companies are likely going to have to pay domestic workers more than they pay foreign workers, so the cost of products could increase. And with the rise of automation, there's no guarantee that deglobalization will increase employment opportunities for American factory workers. Jesse, we could debate the pros and cons of globalization all day, but one of the main arguments against it is that it's widened the wealth gap because it allows companies to secure cheap foreign labor, exploit tax havens, and avoid paying taxes. Multinational corporations can treat foreign workers in ways that would be completely illegal here at home.
Yeah, you know, and that's what you look at with this is who profits from it and all that. But we need to look at globalization and really understand it, I think, if we can. And that is this, Brigitte, it may be inevitable. You know, and I'm talking 100 years down the road when we're long gone. We're only one little planet. And eventually we expand and governments eat each other up and we become more and more down to one. So it may be inevitable. There could be a single government governing the planet Earth at some point in time. I'm not saying it's going to happen in a decade, but it could happen 100 years from now, 200 years from now. There might be only one government. And, then unfortunately, the only people that will be able to escape are going to be Elon Musk, who maybe travel up and live on Mars. So we're all going to be stuck with it one way or another. It has its good, it has its bad. And one of the bad things you just mentioned is this separation of wealth. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer.
The pandemic has also led to some very interesting changes. Now, some companies have announced permanent work-from-home policies, which has led to a debate about the future of commercial real estate. Because if businesses allow employees to work from home, they're probably not going to need these expensive offices. Technology also allows people to conduct meetings and conferences via video, which could reduce the need for work-related travel in the future. What do you think about some of the changes in the work landscape and how it could potentially open up people to more free time on their hands?
Well, that's been one of the good things about the pandemic. It's forced people to work from home, and it's shown us they can do that. You don't have to have all these meetings where people have to travel to them and people have to do this. You can now, with technology, do it all over the internet. It's showing that people can do their jobs from home, and some of the statistics, show that they even perform better at home than they do at the office. So we're learning a great deal, and there's going to be a lot of shift in how we conduct business throughout the United States from the pandemic. Let's learn from it. Let's take the good portions and continue to implement them, and let's learn what doesn't work and what is bad and eliminate those. So we have to be thinking during this pandemic and thinking, how do we make the economy work if we're in a lockdown position, and what can we take forward from that in the future to help save money and make businesses that much more prosperous?
It's time for a break. When we return, Jesse sits down with science writer Steve Olson to talk about the state of nuclear weapons and power 75 years after the U.S. bombings on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We'll be right back.
The world according to Jesse. Steve Olson is an award-winning science writer and a consultant for the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He joins me now to discuss his new book, The Apocalypse Factory. Your new book focuses on the Hanford government facility. Where is the nuclear plant located, and what role did it play in creating the first atomic bombs under the Manhattan Project?
Yes, I grew up in a little small town about 15 miles away from this plant. It's in south central Washington State, in the dry part of Washington State, sort of wheat country, cattle ranching country over there. They wanted a facility that would be in the middle of nowhere so that nobody would get hurt if one of the nuclear reactors blew up.
Now, research and development on the Manhattan Project was so top secret that not even construction and facility workers, they didn't know what their buildings were being used for. Was this completely from compartmentalization? How is this possible? No one would know.
Yeah, it was. Starting in the Manhattan Project back in World War II, when Hanford made the plutonium that was used in the first nuclear explosion at the Trinity test in New Mexico, and then it was used for the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. Anyway, when you were a worker there, you had to sign an agreement saying that you wouldn't tell anyone what it was you were doing. My grandpa worked as a steam fitter at Hanford, and you can't even tell your family what it was that you did. And a lot of them didn't even really know. They just were told, go up this side of the reactor, do these changes, make these changes to it, and don't ask too many questions. That's the best idea.
Yeah, no, compartmentalization. I remember a friend of mine was on SEAL Team 6 and didn't even know he was part of Ollie North's Arms for Hostages till he saw it break on television and realized, wow, I was part of that whole deal. No, that's how the government does it, compartmentalization. In other words, the left hand don't know what the right hand's doing. The federal government seized acres of land from American farmers back then to build the Hanford nuclear reactor. What happens when the government seizes land from Americans? How often did this happen during the first nuclear arms race?
Well, quite a bit. So this was an area, a huge area. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation is about half the size of the state of Rhode Island. And at the time, in 1942, about 1,500 people lived on it. They were farmers, orchardists. Some people lived in towns. Government decided they wanted it. They wanted that land, and all those people got a letter that said, "You've got 6 weeks to move out, and after that, we're going to start moving you out." Now, the government supposedly was going to pay these people the fair value of their land, but then they send the assessors in, and the assessment often came back quite a bit lower than the people who owned that land thought they should get. So that was tied up in court cases for years, till way after World War II. Now, of course, some of those people still live in that area and can remember being kicked off that land 75 years ago.
Wow, and they wouldn't even offer them fair market value for their houses? That's horrible.
Yeah.
Now, after World War II, what role did Hanford play in the Cold War?
So what Hanford does is it makes plutonium. It makes this new element that was just discovered in 1941, and in World War II, people realized that could be used to make atomic bombs, but they didn't realize how good it would be. Plutonium turns out to be the best possible material to make atomic bombs. The bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima, which used uranium, that was just a one-off. They never made one of those weapons again. All of our future weapons were based on plutonium. And the nuclear weapons we have today, we've got 1,500 or so of them that are deployed at this moment. They're all built around a little core about the size of your fist of plutonium. And what that does, it acts as a trigger. It sets off the larger explosion of the hydrogen isotopes that surround the bombs. These are hydrogen bombs, but you need a trigger to get the hydrogen going. And all that is plutonium. And that plutonium was made at Hanford. There was a second site built in the 1950s in South Carolina as well. So those are the two places where we got our plutonium. The Soviets, meanwhile, were building their own plants to make plutonium for their bombs.
Now, nuclear weapons pose a risk to all life on Earth and are an outrageous financial burden. How much money are we talking about when we talk about nuclear weapons?
Oh man, incredible amounts that have been spent on nuclear weapons. And it's amazing because, as you said, if even one of these weapons gets used, it's just an incredible catastrophe. I went to Nagasaki because I wanted to see what the effects of a small nuclear weapon could be on a city. And our weapons today are 50, 60 times as large as the one that was dropped on Nagasaki. I mean, a single nuclear bomb, if it was dropped on a city, on Seattle, Minneapolis, almost everybody in that city would be killed. So we have to ensure that these things are never used, right? We never want bombs, missiles to be headed to the Midwest, for instance, to try to destroy all of our missiles before we launch them at the Soviets. And uh, and so it seems absurd that we spend probably around 50, $60 billion a year on our nuclear weapons program. Over the next 20 or 30 years, there are projections that we could spend $2 trillion on modernizing and miniaturizing our nuclear weapons. And the bizarre thing is, we can't use these weapons. So why do we spend so much money on it? If only we could figure out some way for the countries that have nuclear weapons to say, "Hey, I won't use them if you don't use them," and get rid of them. Everybody would be so much better off. We spend much more money, for instance, on nuclear weapons each year than we spend on healthcare, or not healthcare, but on health research in the U.S. government.
Isn't it amazing what we could do with all that money? We could make the world such a better place. Anyway, the United Arab Emirates just fired up their first nuclear power plant in the Middle East. The facility will provide 25% of the country's electrical needs when fully operational. What are the dangers of relying on nuclear power for electricity?
Yeah, it's true. These nuclear reactors, they were first built at Hanford. The very first nuclear reactor was built at Hanford, and you can still go tour the first large-scale nuclear reactor. It's part of a national park that was established and Hanford is one of 3 sites at it, and it's an incredible thing to see. But you can use nuclear reactors to do 2 things. You can make plutonium with them, or you can make energy with them. And since the 1950s, people have been making energy with them. We are not building any new reactors at the moment, but many other countries are. Many other countries have decided that they need that energy to supply energy for their people. And really, when you look at climate change and with the way that we're getting our energy right now from fossil fuels, it's hard to believe that we can continue to burn fossil fuels without causing great problems, and that we'll be able to get all of our energy from from windmills and solar power. So there may very well be a role for nuclear power, but there are good ways to do it and bad ways to do it, and that's the essential ingredient when you're thinking about nuclear power plants.
Now, what methods are used to safely dispose of nuclear waste?
Yeah, that's right. There's two issues that really come up with nuclear power plants. There's the material. So when you run a nuclear power plant, it makes plutonium, and to make plutonium for bombs, you take that plutonium out of the uranium and you separate it out, and that's what makes the world less safe. Because then you have all this plutonium, a terrorist could get a hold of that, a rogue nation could try to acquire some plutonium and then make a bomb out of it. So that's one issue. Now there are ways to run nuclear power plants in ways that you don't generate purified plutonium, and that's an important consideration as countries start doing this. But then the other issue that you raised is, what do you do with all this nuclear waste that these power plants generate? At the moment, all of our old uranium fuel cells are just sitting in swimming pools or outside in the open air around our nuclear power plants. We don't have any place to put that stuff. They were building a repository in Nevada, but of course, Nevadans weren't extremely enthusiastic about having a lot of nuclear waste placed underneath their mountains. So that project has kind of gone nowhere. We actually don't know what we're going to do with this stuff. And this is an issue that faces every nuclear power plant all around the country. I mean, you got to do something with this waste. The idea is to dig a big hole and put it way down there so that nobody can get at it. And it's certainly technologically doable. I mean, my son's an environmental engineer. The guy says, man, we can clean up almost any mess that human beings have made. It's just that nobody wants that hole, 50 miles away from their house. From
Now, the Trump administration recently established the Nuclear Fuel Working Group to revive and expand America's nuclear energy sector. So far, what has the group accomplished?
Yes, they put out a report, I think it was last April, that made some recommendations, and there were some good recommendations in there. If you think about the fact that we may very well need to build nuclear power plants in the future to supply us with the energy that they want. One was to protect uranium mining. Uranium mines in the United States had dwindled to the point practically of non-existence, and yet it is sort of an important fuel that we need to have access to. Relying on other countries for uranium, if we want to have nuclear energy, is always going to be a dangerous thing. And so there certainly would be a role for government in trying to protect that mining industry. The other thing was about developing new kinds of reactors that would be safer, that wouldn't have the prospects of melting down on you. And there are ways to do that. We haven't built those reactors yet, but they're sort of in development. Again, it's this issue of whether or not you want to build reactors that can't be used to make nuclear weapons, and that's an important consideration in trying to think about these new reactors that people want to build and put up. Maybe small reactors that can be moved around to different places. There's lots of different, there's lots of people here in the Pacific Northwest that are working on these designs because they think that nuclear power is going to be something we need.
Now, we know nuclear power plants can also be used to produce nuclear weapons. When we revitalize nuclear technology, does it impact treaties and non-proliferation efforts?
Yeah, that's the trick. So when you make these nuclear power plants and you run them to generate electricity, you inevitably generate plutonium. But that plutonium is sitting there in those uranium fuel cells, and those fuel cells are so radioactive that there's no way you can get it out. I mean, if you took one of those fuel cells and held it at arm's length, you'd be dead in about a minute. I mean, the amount of radiation from those things is intense. So if you leave the plutonium sitting in those fuel cells, there's no problem at all. The problem is when you do this thing called reprocessing, which started in World War II to make the plutonium for the Nagasaki bomb. You chemically extract the plutonium out of these fuel cells, and then it's in an isolated site. And once you have that plutonium all by itself, that's what you can use to make nuclear weapons. So that's the step that we need to try to outlaw if we want to try to get nuclear weapons under control. And there are treaties that have been proposed to do that. They're not going anywhere right at the moment. There are countries who have been blocking them for one reason or another. But you know, these nuclear weapons pose so much risks to everybody, including us. I mean, there's a submarine base about 20 miles from where I'm sitting right here that has probably 1,000 nuclear weapons that are stockpiled at it. If we ever have a nuclear war, man, that submarine base is going to be the very first thing that's going to get blown up, and I'm going to go with it. So I'm interested in trying to reduce the number of weapons if we possibly can.
Well, unfortunately, Steve, we're out of time, but I want to thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today. Love to have you back in the future sometime. Thank you very much, Steve.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
The world according to Jesse.
Thanks for watching. Send us your comments on Facebook and Twitter for a chance to be featured next week when we cover more stories ignored by the corporate media.
And remember, when the government lies, the truth becomes a traitor. Stay vigilant. Little message for you, Bannon.
The world according to Jesse.